Hi, my name is Sarah Schumann, and I'm the coordinator of the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign, a grassroots initiative that provides fishermen, fisheries associations, and seafood businesses with tools, networking, access, and knowledge to advocate for robust climate solutions that work for U.S. fisheries and not at their expense. The campaign is nonpartisan, and it does not endorse any policy views as a whole. Instead, it is a platform that provides opportunities to help members of the fishing industry develop their own views and amplify their own voices in support of fishery-friendly climate action. In this webinar, a couple of dozen of fishermen heard from Bob Inglis, a former Republican Congressman from South Carolina and the current executive director of republicEn.org, an organization that encourages, emboldens, and advocates for a free enterprise solution to climate change. We felt that this webinar was important to host because in a world in which the loudest voices on the climate issue tend to come only from one side of the political spectrum, we wanted to make dedicated space to hear and celebrate what the other side is doing so that everyone in our politically diverse fishing industry has a place to plug in that aligns with their values. This discussion will be of interest to conservative-leaning fishermen and to non-conservative fishermen who seek to understand the diverse values that motivate different parts of the political spectrum. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Thank you for watching.
First, just an introduction. Inglis, how'd you get to this, man? You run this thing called republicEn.org. You say you're a conservative and you're talking about climate change. Or did you get confused or what? I mean, this is a liberal cause, right? Only liberals care about climate change. Well, that's what I thought for my first 6 years in Congress. Al Gore was for it. I was against it. That was the end of the inquiry for me. Okay, I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was my first 6 years representing Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina in the U.S. Congress. You know, Greenville, Spartanburg has, or South Carolina is a triangle. It's got 3 points, 2 on the ocean, one that I grew up in near Hilton Head. And then the inland point is Greenville, Spartanburg, and that's the district that I represented, a very conservative district in South Carolina. And so I sort of fit that district for those 6 years. Then I was out of Congress for 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. I had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. That's the year that our son, the eldest of our 5 kids, had just turned 18. So he was voting for the first time. And he came to me, he said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. That's a new constituency, you know. These people can change the locks on the doors to your house. Important to respond to those people. So that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. By the way, my son, of course, was going to vote for me no matter what, right? I mean, he knows you can lose by 1 vote. It wasn't his economic interest to vote against me. You know, he just started college. He was definitely going to vote for me. But I think he was really saying was, "Dad, I love you, and you can be better than you were before. So how about make this Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version?" So that was step 1. Step 2 is going to Antarctica with the science committee and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. We can go into that in the Q&A time if you want to. And then step 3 was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems improbable, doesn't it, on a godless science committee trip? Because we all know that all scientists are godless. Apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist who was snorkeling with me, showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef, I could see was worshiping God in what he was showing me. You know, St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, I don't know if he actually said it, but supposedly said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And so Scott Heron, the guy who was the Aussie climate scientist showing me all those things, who's become a very dear friend now, I could tell as we were snorkeling together, even without any words, that he and I shared a worldview, because I could see that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me at the Great Barrier Reef, the corals and the challenge of coral bleaching. And so later we had a chance to talk, to actually use words. And so he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning as much as possible in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place. Hangs the family's clothes out on the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. That's a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon tax. Pay no attention, ladies and gentlemen, those last two words. Let's focus on the first two. It's a revenue neutral and border adjustable. I'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, it didn't go well for me politically after that. Note to self: do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession, when you represent perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. It will not go well. It did not go well at all. In fact, after 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote in a Republican runoff. The other guy got the other 71% of the vote. Rather spectacular faceplant in politics. After 12 years in Congress, you usually don't get just 29% unless you've been indicted or something. And I hadn't been indicted. It's just I was out of step with the Tea Party orthodoxy that developed. So at that point, a foundation came to me and said, Inglis, you're an unusual zoo animal. An actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union lifetime rating, 100% Christian coalition, 100% national right to life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, a liberal group, and 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the labor union. I was really gunning for a 0, so I don't know how I got a 23. So they said, actual conservative who says climate change was real. Will you speak and write for the proposition? So that's what we've been doing ever since. It's now this thing called republicEn.org. EN for energy, entrepreneurship, the environment. It's a community of about 20,000 people online at this point. We need a 0 or 2 on the end of that number. So if you're a conservative and you care about climate change, join us. If you go to that website, republicEn.org, it'll take you all about 45 seconds. The join button will follow you wherever you go on the website. All we need is your zip code and your email address, and we'll keep you up to date on things going on and help make you visible to your member of Congress and to your senators. So that's how I got to this. That's the story about how this conservative from South Carolina got all hepped up on climate change. Second thing I thought I'd do here is talk about the landscape. As Sarah just mentioned, the landscape that commercial fishermen face, that really the whole world faces in terms of what's available to us as way of policy. And I know this is going to sound simplistic, but there are really just 3 ways to deal with climate change, or to the policy solutions. There's just 3 of them. You can attempt to regulate emissions. You can do clean energy incentives, or you can do a carbon tax and apply it to Chinese goods. Really, it's one of those 3. Those are the 3 buckets of policy that are out there. The first one, regulate emissions, doesn't come naturally to me or to the folks at this thing we call republicEn.org, as you can imagine. We sort of break out in hives when you mention the word regulation, start itching all over, because we find regulations pretty inefficient and easy to evade and very litigious and just sort of. But anyway, if you see government as a helpful force, then that regulatory approach is a respectable position. It's just not our position at republicEn.org. But I would ask you, even if you do sort of take a positive view toward regulation, how you can get China in on those regulations. That's the real weakness of the regulatory approach. You can't regulate China from here in America. And so you can regulate here, you can regulate emissions here, and that'd be great. We'll have cleaner air, fewer hospitalizations because we'll have fewer asthma cases. Rich America will do great in that situation. And that's a good argument for regulation. See, we're going to have a longer life expectancy here in America if we do this. Could be. But you're just cleaning up local air. you're not solving climate change yet, because in order to solve climate change, you got to get the whole world in on it. That's what makes this such a devilish problem. So the regulatory approach we think falls short, but some people will pursue it. It's probably what the Green New Deal is. Is that it's a regulatory approach, presumably. It's not really been reduced to legislative language, but that's presumably what it is. So that's one approach, the regulatory approach. Second approach is clean energy incentives. This is now the law. The Inflation Reduction Act, okay, misnamed, but should have been maybe the Clean Energy Bill or something, I don't know, but didn't have a whole lot to do with inflation, but had a lot to do with clean energy incentives. Tax credits mostly for nuclear, for hydrogen, for wind and solar. If I were still in Congress and that were a freestanding bill, I probably would have voted for those provisions. And I would have been joined by a good number of other Republicans, I think. But the Inflation Reduction Act was a reconciliation bill. That's where you don't have but a bare majority in the Senate, and so you cram it through in a budget process called reconciliation. When we Republicans did it to Democrats, there were 0 Democrat votes for it. When the Democrats just did it on this Inflation Reduction Act, they got 0 Republican votes for it. It's an inherently partisan process. And so, but if it had been a freestanding bill, I think there would have been a good number of Republicans voting for those credits, those tax credits. Because after all, a tax credit reduces taxation. So what conservative hasn't ever met a tax credit they didn't like? So Republicans probably would have voted for it if it had been a freestanding bill, or a good number of them would have. But here's what we have to admit. There's a little bit of a similarity between, number one, the regulatory approach, and number two, the clean energy approach, which is maybe the clean energy provisions only work if you pay American taxes. You can incentivize corporations, individuals who pay American taxes through the American tax code, but you can't incentivize Chinese corporations that way. They don't pay American taxes. So what do they care about the credits? It doesn't affect their economics. So again, you may fall into the trap that number one had, which was clean up local air, great, fewer asthma cases, longer life expectancy, great stuff here in America, breathing better, but not solving climate change yet. Now, in fairness to people that take this position, the second position, they'd say, yeah, Inglis, but early adoption here in America will drive down the cost of the technology and it'll be affordable around the world. To which I say, hope so, don't know so. The reason I don't know so is we're really rich here in America. We may not feel rich every day, but we're really rich compared to the emitting world. And so we probably can afford this technology. And it will be done. I mean, this Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to deploy a lot of wind and solar, hopefully, in my view, build a lot of nuclear plants, hopefully also figure out how to use hydrogen effectively. And so the reason I don't know that it will spread, though, around the world is, if you think about it, for example, the power production business is a relatively small business, a small number of firms in it, maybe 20, 30,000 companies in the whole world that make electricity for customers. That's a relatively small market. And when you have new technology in a relatively small market, the price usually stays up pretty high. Contrast that with, say, the cell phone market. There are 8 billion people who would love to have a cell phone in their pocket. And so that makes the price come down dramatically as people, is the people who make cell phones want to get more and more market by driving the price of individual units down so they get more customers. It's a Walmart strategy, high volume, low margin. But if you have a small market, you have sort of the boutique pricing, which is high margin, low volume. And so That concerns me about option 2, which is the clean energy approach. Having now dissed option 1, the regulatory approach, and 2, the clean energy approach, you can tell that I favor option 3, which is the carbon tax pricing approach and applying it to Chinese imports. And basically, this is the way it works. You do a carbon tax here in America. Because I'm a conservative, I'd want to cut taxes somewhere else in equal amount. Just change what you tax. Untax income, in my case, I would say, let's untax FICA. You know, the FICA, 6.2% employee, 6.2% employer, unless you're self-employed, in which case you pay the whole 12.4%. It's a whoppingly regressive tax in that it hits people at their first dollar of income. So if you reduce that tax and put on a carbon tax, the Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better. Because you can do things to avoid the carbon tax. You can drive less, you can turn the thermostat down, put plastic on the windows in the winter, do things like that. But you can't avoid that FICA tax unless you become an illegal employee of an illegal employer or don't report your self-employment taxes. And so you can basically untax some form of income or dividend all the money from the carbon tax back to the citizenry. So there's no growth of government. We think that's a conservative answer to the way you want to price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels, but you want to give the money back to people so they can afford it. So that's the revenue neutral part. And like I said, in 2010, that didn't help me that it was revenue neutral. It was just there was a carbon tax. But the second thing it is something called border adjustable. And what that means is you apply this same tax to imports from countries that don't have the same carbon tax. So let's take an example. There's a sheet of flat steel coming through the port of Seattle right now from China. They stole the technology, they manipulated their currency, and here they come to compete with American steel. And they're landing the steel in Seattle. We apply our carbon tax. They object in the World Trade Organization, saying you can't do that, impermissible tariff. We think they lose that case based on chemical industry cases that say, oh no, you can have a content tax, taxing something based on the content of what it is coming into your country. And this would be a carbon content tax. If we're right, and it's upheld by the World Trade Organization, China, 24 hours later, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus, don't they? Not a very fair government, not a very nice government, but doggone efficient. Why 24 hours? Well, they just paid in Seattle a tax, carbon tax, that got sent to Washington, D.C. If they'd collected that tax inside China, that sheet of flat steel would come through Seattle with no adjustment. And the tax money would be in Beijing. So 24 hours later, they got the same price on carbon dioxide, the same carbon tax. And then if you're doing business anywhere in the world, you're doing business with America and China, so it spreads worldwide. That we think is a real kicker here. That's why we're so big on option 3, which is a carbon tax. And to give you some specific numbers on that, let's say it's $30 per ton price on carbon dioxide. In other words, the IRS goes to the mines in America and the pipeline people, and they say, we just taxed everything coming through the pipeline or coming up out of that mine. We know how much CO2 is going to be emitted in the burning of the coal and the burning of the petroleum products. There's good science on that. We know it's a pretty easily determined number. You apply a $30 per ton price. And by the way, there are under 2,000 companies that either mine coal or put stuff in a pipeline in America. So it's a very small job for the IRS. They could do it in a, 5,000 square foot office building. It's a very small job, 2,000 taxpayers. And so, but then of course, the price of everything, it's good that's administratively simple, but the bad news is the price of everything downstream goes up. The diesel you're putting in your boats, the plastic on the floats, everything goes up in price. That's the bad news. But how much does it go up? Well, $30 a ton turns into 30 cents a gallon at the gas pump, local gas pump. Price of electricity goes up by $11 a month on the average home. So that's why I think it's so important. You gotta do something for people at the low income level, because if you have a 30 cent per gallon increase in the price of fuel, and diesel, I presumably be higher than that, because diesel is, even though oddly it's less refined, but it costs more. It's a boutique fuel, is what I understand from the industry. That if you're going to pay that extra price, then we need to cut your taxes somewhere else, or dividend the money back to you from the carbon tax, so that you can pay that 30 cents a gallon or that $11 a month. But here's the thing. This third approach, as you can see, has no preference as to policy, as to technology. We think it's the best policy. It's better than regulating. It's better than the clean energy incentives, and it's more powerful because it gets you worldwide. This third thing does, and doesn't let China get away with creating climate change when we're cleaning up our act here. But it's not technology specific. Now, for this purposes of this webinar, that might be a weakness, because you want to talk about things that specifically affect people that are in the fishing industry. And here I am talking about just pricing carbon dioxide, and I don't know whether that means that offshore wind is going to be attractive or not, or whether in order to do all these electrification of the fleet, they're going to need to be more copper mines, and whether those copper mines their trailings are going into the streams and ending up in the ocean and destroying the fishery. We're sort of silent on all that, because the idea is you price it in, and then you let the free enterprise system sort out what technologies work. And in some places, it will be wind offshore or onshore. In some places, it'll be solar. Other places, it will be acceptance of nuclear, particularly if we get to small modular nukes. All of these technologies probably require more copper, though. And copper mines, I know, have sort of a bad record with fisheries. So that means that the work isn't all done if you're in the fishing business, because you got to figure out how to keep that stuff out of the streams. And you got to figure out, if they can do offshore wind, how it's going to work. But it's like those questions remain. But what we would like to see at republicEn.org is not that we get in this situation of thinking we here in America are going to clean up our act, but we're not going to get the rest of the world in. If you don't get the world in, you're not solving climate change. And so it's what we find as we reach out to fellow conservatives is the very legitimate mental block, which is, tell me how to get the world in on this thing. And that's what we think is answered by this pricing mechanism that's applied at our ports. So I've described how I got to this, and then described the 3 ways we can solve climate change from a policy perspective, leaving open the technological question about what's going to be deployed. But I'd be glad to hear your questions or comments about this.
Thanks, Bob. That was very, very well explained, and a lot of thought packed into a short presentation, but very clear. And I really appreciate the way you laid out the 3 options and the pros and cons of each approach. It's like high-level political philosophy about the biggest issue facing humanity, but just all the nuances were captured. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. So we're going to take Q&A, and I had wanted to exercise my facilitator privilege and get the first question to Bob. You sort of went over this already, but as you have picked up on from our conversation already, one of the primary concerns for us as fishermen is not just ensuring that climate change is addressed and that it does so in a way that the whole world is on board, like you said, but also that we're also considering and mitigating the impacts of the solutions. So the offshore wind and the mining and anything else. And right now, there doesn't seem to be really any framework in place to even consider those impacts. It seems like what we have right now, right, with the Inflation Reduction Act, sort of the approach that has won the day so far is the second one, the clean energy incentives, throwing a lot of money at the problem and tax credits. So that's where we are right now, and seeing a flurry of activity, which many of us have been engaging in actually through a bunch of letter writing that we've been doing collectively as an industry, trying to put in letters to all of the agencies that are in charge of implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, and doing what we can to convince them to implement that act in a way that is fishery friendly. But at this point, when there isn't really even any discussion of what some of the impacts of the solutions are on local environments, like the ones that we depend on, there really hasn't emerged this sort of high-level ideological thinking of what constitutes a conservative approach versus a more regulatory approach or whatever. But it's something we see a need for. Do you have any thoughts about any advice for us on sort of how to get that conversation going with our elected officials, and what might work better for different ideological bents?
Yeah, well, yeah, and let me admit, that's option 3. Not a lot of people are talking about it right now. If you walk the halls of Congress today, you'd think, okay, Inglis had a fine story about that option 3, but I don't see anything happening in Congress about that. So as you just said, Sarah, the thing that has happened is the Inflation Reduction Act, and it has a lot of those credits. It's a lot of money, and that stuff is going to be deployed in America. The nuclear, the hydrogen, the wind, the solar projects are going to go forward because those tax credits are powerful. Now, are they effective? I can tell you there are a good number of economists who try to do the pricing of that, and some of them would say that yeah, it's gonna work. It's just a pretty expensive way actually to get carbon reduction. But be that as it may, still it's happening. So that's just a granted. But here's what is happening in Congress, and it gets directly to your question, I think, about how to engage here. There are 2 things that are going to create momentum in this current Congress. One is going to be the European Union's consideration or going forward with a carbon border adjustment mechanism called CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's basically what that is just describing, in that applying the tax to that Chinese steel coming through Seattle. They're going to do that to our stuff. So we have Nucor Steel here in South Carolina. They're going to ship aluminum to Europe. If Europe goes forward with this carbon border adjustment mechanism, Nucor is going to pay a carbon tax on entering that aluminum into Europe. And it's going to come back to the 1st District Congresswoman, Nancy Mace, Nucor is going to be saying to Nancy, hey, Nancy, you realize we're paying a carbon tax on entry to Europe that you could have collected here and had the money in America, but it doesn't make any difference to our customer, because pay it here or pay it there, it goes into the price. And so it doesn't matter. It's just, wouldn't you rather have the money here rather than us paying it to Europeans? And so light bulbs are going to start going off in Congress. We think about, we could do the same thing. We could have a carbon border adjustment mechanism and stick it to the Chinese products. And so light bulbs are going to go off. So that may create momentum. But the second thing that gets more directly to the fisheries concern, I think, is there's going to be a lot of talk about permitting reform. And my answer to you about your concerns about stuff getting in the waterways and the disruption caused by offshore wind is that both of those have a regulatory component. And by the way, even though I said that I sort of break out in hives at the mention of regulations, I realize you got to have some regulations. It's just, what's the best way to solve climate change? I don't think it's regulating, because you can't regulate Chinese emissions. But if you're talking about a copper mine that's fouling the stream and destroying the estuary and messing up the near coast, that's not a good outcome. And so the only way that I know to deal with that is a regulatory approach, right? It says, listen, you can't do that. If you mine copper, you got to mine it carefully. You got to keep your tailings, contained. You got to do it right way. So there's a need for regulation there. The question in this permitting reform is going to be this, and this is going on right now. In fact, here pretty soon, Republicans in Congress will be having a bill on the floor about permitting reform. This is the second momentum maker. The first one is that European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The second one is this permitting question about, should we make it easier to get a permit to build that mine? Should we make it easier to get the permit for the offshore wind? One of the ideas is to say, Joe Manchin's bill says that for complicated projects, the waiting period, the permitting period, I think he says in that bill or his proposal, can't be any longer than 2 years. For a simple project, can't be longer than 1 year. So in other words, it speeds up the regulatory process. I'll tell you, there are many environmental groups that disagree with that. They don't want that to happen because they're worried about that speed being not their friend. If you want to build the copper mine, you want speed. If you're an environmental group, you want to do anything you can to stop it. But there's got to be some balance there, because it's like this. If we're going to electrify the fleet, you got to have a lot more copper, because EVs do not fall from heaven like manna. Somebody's got to go mine the copper. Somebody's got to mine the cobalt, hopefully without slave labor. Somebody's got to get the nickel. Somebody's got to get the lithium. And somebody's got to make all the stuff that goes into said car. And you got to get, if it's wind, you got to get the power from Kansas, where it's made, across Missouri to Chicago, where it's consumed. And right now, you can't much get across there, because FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, can order pipelines to be built, but they can't order power lines to be built. And so that's one of the questions in this permitting reform. So that's the balance we're going to have to strike. The good news for fishermen, I think, is the regulations will remain in place about impact on fisheries. The question is whether they're relaxed too much from your perspective. The regulations will remain in place with regard to outflow or wash away from mines. The question is whether that will work for you, or whether it's whether the speeding that up is actually detrimental to your concern. So anyway, I'm aware that permitting reform is a big issue right now for you and for everybody, really.
It is, and I think a lot of us in the industry probably feel that even the status quo is perhaps a little bit too lax when it comes to some of these other industries impacting the ecosystems that fisheries depend on, while we in the fishing industry are regulated to the hilt and often have to bear the brunt of the impacts of other industries. The ones who have to sort of pay the price are us, often in the form of an increase in the regulatory burden that we ourselves have to deal with. But that's just an aside. I will stop talking, and I would like to open the floor to others to ask questions while we've got 15 more minutes of Bob's time. I'm anticipating Kent might want to say something, since I know carbon pricing is a favorite topic of yours. Kent, would you like to speak up and let us know what you're thinking?
Well, yeah, I was trying to formulate some kind of question for Bob. Thanks, Bob. I mean, I've heard you speak before and really appreciate your your voice in this realm. And, I consider myself a conservative, and I consider myself the whole divide is just troubling to me. Why, we park ourselves in camps, and how it can be that conservatives in general, and maybe the party specifically, that we don't see the predicament we're in, or we turn our back to it. And I just wondered if there must be voices on the Hill, on the Republican side, that are going to be working towards the third approach that you outlined there. And is that the case, and how do we support those voices?
I think there are people that are interested in that third approach. Our pricing, the one that we favor. And actually, you know what? It's not just us. It's most economists in the world. And I know in this age of political overstatement, that sounds like an overstatement, but it's really not. It's hard to find an economist that wouldn't say the first and most obvious thing to do about climate change is to do a carbon tax. If it's a conservative economist, they'd say, well, cut taxes somewhere else, or dividend the money back to the citizenry, so don't grow the government. If you're a progressive economist, you might not care so much about that. But it's the consensus in the economic profession, among economists, is even greater than the consensus among the scientists about the causes. Because the economists would say, yeah, that's obviously the thing to do. So the thing is, there are Republicans in Congress who know that. They know to sort of bow at the mention of the name of Milton Friedman, Now, if you're a populist nationalist, maybe you don't know or care who Milton Friedman was, but if you're an actual conservative, you know that, he was Reagan's economics advisor, father of the Chicago School of Economics, favorite of all libertarians. On the Phil Donahue show one time, Phil Donahue asked him, what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? Friedman says, you tax it. You tax pollution. And then he goes on to explain what I've just been talking about here, which is you put the cost in, and then in freedom, consumers choose their self-interest. They go to the store and they see a plastic fork that now has all of its cost associated with it because it's got a carbon tax on it, and a wooden spork. It has some carbon tax in it because the gal or the guy chopping down the pine tree in Georgia needed to use some diesel to do that. But the price relative between those two is that the spork is now a lot cheaper than the plastic fork. Now, we're for freedom. And I think if Milton Friedman were still alive, he'd say, yeah, he's for freedom. Choose the plastic if you want to pay the extra, pay the price. But we shouldn't let you get away with a freebie. Pay for what you take is the whole idea. And so, in answer to your question, Ken, yes, there are Republicans in Congress who know that and who believe that deeply. Their constituents haven't quite heard it explained yet. I mean, it's taken me 20 minutes here or something to explain this, right? And when you're explaining, you're losing in politics. And so that's the hard thing about this, is it takes some real explaining. But I think that there will be the point at which we realize, hey, you know what? We got to get the world in. And how are you going to do that? Well, use the power of the American market to do something really powerful, which is make it in the world's interest to follow our lead. Not because of some international agreement that took forever to negotiate, a lot of bowing and scraping at the UN, protracted negotiations. No, just a bold move by the United States that says, we're going to tax carbon dioxide and you're going to pay it. Now, if you don't want to pay our carbon tax, do your own. But if you want to do your own, fine, keep on paying ours, because we've got a terrible debt and an awful deficit. So please keep paying our carbon tax on your stuff coming into our country. So it basically turns it around so that the world says, okay, we see it. We're going to do what you're doing because it's in our interest. Because that first one, that regulatory approach, what that assumes is that the Chinese are going to say, oh, we want to be morally righteous like those Americans because they're regulating stuff. How's that working out with us for us on human rights, or maybe whale fishing and things like that, or shark things? Not too well, I don't think. I don't think they're following our moral example. And they're not going to follow our moral example on climate either. But making their interest, and you get them in the pocketbook, they'll do it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Bob. I love the way you explain things. I'm going to post in the chat the link to the Economist statement of 27 former Nobel laureates and 3,500 academic economists that describe the biggest market failure in history to be the failure to account for the external costs of fossil fuels, for anybody that might be interested in that.
That's great. That's good stuff. What else you want to know? Questions or comments? Help me understand anything I should about fishing.
Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this sounds very logical and in a simple when you view it like that, and a lot of tax law has always begun that way. Everything makes sense, but we, we in America and the rest of the world are more and more realizing that these taxes don't hit everybody the same way. Yeah, there's the people of wealth and the politicians and people just do not end up paying those taxes. They work their way around those taxes somehow, and it's just time and time again that it filters down to the working class people, and those are the ones that have to decide about those plastic spoons. The wealthy don't give a shit about, excuse the language, about plastic spoons or anything else. They're still going to get on their private jets, and they're still going to do all this, or they're still going to not care about carbon usage and things like that. So how do we tackle that whole thing of that taxes just don't work fairly?
Yeah. Well, you're onto something. A carbon tax, while it's broad-based, will not impact everybody equally. If you're a trucker, for example, you're going to be more impacted by that 30-cent per gallon increase in the price based on a $30 per ton price on carbon dioxide. And as I said, diesel is probably going to be more than that. Yeah, I don't know, 35, 30, 40, 42 cents per gallon increase, right? And so if you're a trucker, you're going to be more impacted than somebody that's, an accountant or a lawyer or a nurse at a hospital. But here's the thing. Do you remember when price of gas first went up to like $4 a gallon, and we all started paying the delivery surcharge on UPS? That's what those truckers are going to have to do if this carbon tax goes through. They're going to have to say, listen, folks, I can't deliver your equipment to your new plant or whatever at what you used to pay, because here's the fuel surcharge, and show it on the bill. And I don't know, I remember when it first happened that UPS was doing that. It's all understandable to us, right? That, hey, listen, if that's when the price of gasoline went up to $4 for the first time. We were all shocked. We got used to it, right? And so, yeah, you're right that not everybody's going to be impacted the same way, but it does mean that then there's a drive to innovate. So, for example, not long-haul trucking, although it's possible, long-haul trucking with big batteries in the truck may work. There's some hydrogen possibilities there. There's going to be a drive for innovation there to make those long-haul trucks work on something besides diesel. Short haul, I mean, in other words, the delivery vans, pretty quickly, it's going to be in their interest to switch over to electric. And so no delivery charge there, no surplus delivery charge. But let me just also say this too, Richard, is it we're at republicEn.org, we take sort of an unusual position about those rich people and their heated pools. I want you to be free. If you're rich and you have a heated pool in Boston, Massachusetts, have us over for a pool party in this month or next. Because I want you to be free to have that pool if you want it. But here's the thing, pay the full price of heating that pool. And if you do, and you start seeing that increase on your bill about the true cost of burning the fossil fuels that made that electricity, you're probably going to drain that pool until maybe the 1st of June. Then have us over for the pool party. We'll come over in June. But I'm for you. If you want to heat your pool in January, fine. Just pay the full cost. Because we think that that's how you get people to regulate their own appetites. You know, if you have what I say is in the salad bar of life, take what you want, but pay for what you take. If you do that, the restaurateur can have a turkey slicing station and olives and cheese on the salad bar. But if you let people step off the end of that salad bar without paying based on weight, come back in 2 weeks. Iceberg lettuce chopped up, Thousand Island dressing and croutons, that's all that's going to be on that salad bar, because that's all the restaurant can afford to put out there. Because, hey, they're free riders. That is rock solid conservatism. That's what conservatives really believe, that, yeah, you got to pay for what you take. And so heat your pool if you want to, but you're probably going to drain it. Let the long haul trucker say to just deliver this equipment, it's got a $50 surcharge on it, and you're going to have to pay that because that's the only way I can stay in business. And then that drives some decision making. People start looking for local equipment, maybe, or something. You know, they do some stuff. So yeah, I don't think we've solved all the problems of the world here. In other words, but it does get at this fundamental thing of just pay for what you take in the salad bar of life. You know, you do that, people regulate their own appetites. By the way, the English kids know how to go to that salad bar. You know what you do? First, you load up on the spinach. Then you can have all the mushrooms you want, put all the croutons you want on there. But for goodness sakes, do not ever get cantaloupe or watermelon. That's water. You're paying for that. So my 5 kids, they load up with the spinach. You know, it's like you can do stuff to avoid the cost. I got some hands up here, Sarah. So what do I do?
Do you have time to stick on a few more minutes? We're at the hour and we want to respect your time. Okay,
Yes.
if you do, thank you. Jim Kendall's got a question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you know, Bob, that might work in a utopian world, but in the fishing industry, in the fishing world, it's not quite that simplistic. We don't really have the opportunity or the way to pass on those extra costs of the fuel or the taxes. When you watch back or look back at the COVID experience, when every bit of fuel went up, and probably one of the highest was for the fishing industry, you got to remember some of these boats use thousands and thousands of gallons per trip. Smaller boats are in the hundreds, and that matches any of the trucks you're talking about. But we don't have a way to pass on those costs because the buyers at the fish houses don't really observe your costs. They're worried about their costs. And if it's costing them more for their trucks, they're not going to increase our prices. So when you're the low man on the totem pole, everything falls down on you. And you know what I'm talking about when I say everything falls down on you. So like I say, there may be some way to make it work, and it may be necessary to do so. But not everybody's going to feel the same pains or the same reactions that you put out there so far. Pass it on. We don't have the opportunity or the ability to really pass it on. And I think some of these other fishermen might agree with me.
Yeah, and farmers are in the same spot, right? They use a lot of fossil fuels for their businesses. I think that well, you're definitely onto a challenge there, because it's one that I wanted to teach my kids. You know how I did it. We had a big potato harvest one year at our farmette, and so I said, I want you to go sell them at the little grocery store near us. And so they sold they got just a couple dollars for the potatoes. And then they went and they saw the price that was actually on them to the customer. And it's a great lesson in economics for my 5 kids, as they saw that, oh, I see. The store is the one that got most of the profit there, not the farmer, them that had dug those potatoes. Same thing with fishing, right? I mean,
No, it's not, because the fishing industry is limited as to how they can get rid of their fish. You may get a permit to sell your fish at the dock direct to the customer, but other than that, if you don't get that permit, you're not allowed to handle fish that way. The restrictions on the fishing industry are much more tightly involved than any of the other industries that I know of. So
yeah. But what I'm talking about is just the amount. If you talk about the ultimate price at the grocery store is $15 a pound for flounder or something, only a dollar or two of that's going to the fisherman, and then the middleman gets serious bit of it, and then the grocery store gets a bit of it. And so that's what I'm talking about our potatoes, is they saw just how little the ones that actually grew the potatoes got out of it. So that's a continuing problem. I don't think that our third solution here solves all the problems of the world. What I would imagine would happen was, at some point, we're going to realize that, hey, you know what? The boats just aren't going out. Now, do you want fish or not? And if you want fish, pay us for the fuel. That's it. I sound like a union organizer there, don't I? I said I had a 23 with the AFL-CIO, but that's the thing. You just sort of say, hey, the boats aren't going out. Or you want to eat? Well, you like bread? Well, you have to pay us for the wheat. And the combine needs an awful lot of diesel. And so anyway, that's you're right, though. That's a challenge that's still ahead of us. But which would you rather? Would you rather have a government sedan come by and figure out whether you're complying with the regulations about climate? Or would you rather just price it in? So like BMW, came to South Carolina. It means Bubba makes wheels. That's why they came here. But, they had like $14 billion on the ground in Spartanburg, South Carolina, make some very fine cars. And when they came here, they told me, listen, Mr. Congressman, we're sure South Carolina EPA has some fine engineers, but please don't have them attempt to tell us how to paint a BMW, because we can assure you that we know how to paint a BMW better than anybody in the world. It's like 17 coats of paint on the hood of the Z3s that they were making back then. And they said, just tell us how many parts per million we can emit. We'll take it from there, because we're an engineering company that happens to make cars. That's the approach we're talking here, right? Not the government of South Carolina coming and saying, let's regulate how you're doing that painting. No, just tell me how many parts per million. And so in this carbon tax, what we're saying is, don't have a government sedan come to the dock and check your emissions out of the diesel stack, but rather say, no need for a government sedan to come to the dock, because it's in the price of the fuel. Now figure it out. In freedom, figure it out. The price is in, the cost is associated with it. Now do something. And so it's a lot easier, a lot more efficient way, we think, of getting to decisions.
Can we hear from some of the other people on the chat here to see what their feelings are on some of this?
Yeah, Angela, I think, had your hand up, right?
No, I just raised my hand. I am Al Catoni, a Gloucester fisherman.
Oh, great.
Jim raises some good points, and the carbon tax, the tax on the fuel could also work, but the fishing industry is very unique in a lot of ways. Not just the fact that we're beholden to the buyers, we're also beholden to imports. So if we don't bring fish in, the buyers just get it. They just fill the void with more imports, and the imported fish is usually coming from Europe, from subsidized countries. They subsidize their fishery and they market their fishery. So we're behind the 8 ball there to begin with. If we start taxing our fuel, that'd be pretty much, you know, a death knell for the domestic fishery, in my opinion.
Mhm. Yeah, it definitely is going to be an impact. That's for sure.
Well, it would be more than an impact, because we can't compete with, you know, with our European competitors with the imports as it is now. So
yeah. Oh yeah, there's the key. There's the
right.
key.
So unless there is some kind of tariff on imports or something like that, I mean, it's a lose. It's a big loss for the domestic fishery.
Yeah, that's what I want. Is the second thing here is revenue neutral means that we're going to cut your taxes somewhere else. So you get a bigger FICA, you get a reduction in your FICA. So you've got money in your paycheck that you didn't have before, or you get a dividend check. And then second thing is that European competitor is going to have to pay, because they're going to start paying because of their own government. But we can do that. What they're getting ready to do to us as we export to them, we could do to everybody importing to us, is collect that carbon tax. So it makes it so that they're not getting in here scot-free and you're paying. No, they're paying too.
And another consequence of just higher fuel prices in general, you know, Jim mentioned this also, that when we land our fish, you know, the fish buyers have to buy it off the auction. They have to process it, they have to load it in trucks, and they have to ship it. And that reflects our price. So they're recouping their losses on the price that they give the harvester, no matter how they occur the losses, whether it be high fuel prices or a bad market. So when the price of fuel goes high, we're usually getting less price at the dock, because the buyers are recouping their losses for fuel on our backs. So what, like again, like Jim said, we're the low man on the pole, and it's really tough to kind of sift through what's going to work to reduce carbon emissions in our industry on taxes, when we have, you know, different innovative ways, you know, with engine technology and gear technology that might work better in that aspect.
Yeah. And Angela, do you have something you want to add to that, or is it some similar
I
thing?
just was going to say what I said on the imports, but at the same time, since the beginning of this nightmare that we are facing with offshore wind, and we clean the environment, is we don't have a conservation plan anywhere. We are not teaching anyone how to save energy, how to protect the climate from some of the stupid things we might be doing. And that really bothers me very much, because at this moment, I just cannot see losing our ocean to offshore wind. So somebody can get up in the morning, put their TV on, then go into the other room to have coffee, and their TV is on and nobody's watching it. And because of that, we're going to be doing more damage to the environment. So we just cannot talk from both sides of our mouth. That people need to understand that every person can do something, and we could really be in good shape without damaging our environment even more than we're doing right now.
Yeah, I think, well, you're certainly onto something there. I think, first of all, you're definitely onto something, how we all speak out of both sides of our mouths. That's just a human condition, right? But here's the thing. It's like this. What I'd suggest to you is, you know, even though I dispute, I was in conscious disregard of the science of climate change for my first 6 years. Then that changed, as I described. Climate change is happening, it's for real, and it gets personal for me when it comes to fishing, for example, because Bluffton, South Carolina oysters are the best in the world. Anybody want to fight me for that distinction? And so the thing about Bluffton oysters is they're smaller, they're having some trouble. It could be just too many people in the estuaries and too much wave action. It could be the heat. It could be natural pest, or it could be ocean acidification, or it could be all four of those. But we got smaller and not as many Bluffton oysters. And that gets real personal to me. And so So climate change is happening. It's personal to you. You're seeing it in the fisheries. It's happening. And so then the question is, well, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to fix it? And the really devilish thing is it's worldwide. So you got to get the whole world in on this thing. And that's why the only way I know to do that is to collect a carbon tax on stuff coming from countries that don't have a carbon tax and make it in their interest to do the same thing. And if they do, then 8 billion people start seeing the true cost of stuff. And when they do, Angela, I think what it means is they will turn off the TV while they're having the coffee in the kitchen. Because it's like, oh, turn off the lights, turn down the heat, turn down the air conditioning, whatever. They'll do stuff because they'll start seeing the price of it, the true price. It's either that or have the government sedan come by and say, wait a minute, you should have been watching the TV, or you should turn the TV off before you made the coffee. Well, how's that going to work out? Knock on the door with the government sedan parked out front. I mean, that's a regulatory approach. Or it's this incentives that just does American stuff, American clean air, doesn't get the Chinese in on it. And so there are bad impacts. I mean, we've identified some, and this has really helped me. Sarah, I appreciate the opportunity to be with people that are in the real world dealing with the real world problem, especially of fuel cost. Because I've always mentioned farmers. Now, after this webinar, I'm going to mention fishermen as people who are uniquely impacted by this carbon tax in fuel. And I do understand that thing about how, the most of the profit is going to somebody besides the guy or the gal that harvested it. And that's just the setup of our economic system. And it's got some flaws in it, and we need to figure out how to fix that. But that's beyond my capacity. That's something beyond the writ of republicEn.org. That's about how to get some kind of collective or cooperative or something going among fishermen that says, listen, you want to buy our fish, buyers, well, you're going to pay this because look at what, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Y'all got to figure that one out.
Kent had his hand up for quite a while and never got recognized. So you might want to check to see if he's still interested.
Yeah.
Bob, how long do you want? Bob, give us a firm cutoff for when you need to leave so that we're not just monopolizing your time all night.
I really, my phone is telling me these other things I'm supposed to be doing, but okay. I can go until 5:20. How about that?
Great, thank you. Can I just interject very briefly, because on this topic of fuel costs and fishing vessels, I wanted to note that last year there was a viable carbon pricing bill in Congress called the Energy Innovation Act. And I worked with a commercial fisherman in Alaska, George Donart, he's a set netter on the Yukon River, and he's also the leader of the Citizens Climate Lobby Seafood Action Working Group. He's a member of our listserv as well. And we worked to lobby, I think he talked to his Alaska elected officials, and I worked with some Rhode Island people to talk to Senator Whitehouse's staff about ensuring that if a carbon pricing bill were to move forward, that the fishing industry would receive the same exemptions that farmers were going to receive on red diesel, on the grounds that we are already as fuel efficient as we can be. We rely on use of diesel in order to feed the world, and therefore should be exempt from any carbon tax. So if folks on this call are interested in getting active on carbon pricing in the future, if you felt motivated by this, or if something like that were to come into the foreground of policymaking again, that's a way that we could address that to ensure that our industry isn't taking the brunt of something when we have no other options to adapt to that. Sorry, I just ate up 2 minutes of the 4 minutes we had left, but Kent, did you want to say something real quick?
I defer. Thank you so much, Bob, Sarah, everyone.
Okay, Jim, did you have another?
No, Angela.
Angela, is your hand still up or did you put it up again?
No, my hand is not up, but I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone to be in this. It's just unbelievable that I'm sitting in this office in Massachusetts on the farther corner of the United States and see people from across the country.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful because we all learn from each other. And this is really nice. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, well, it's been wonderful to be with you, and really, honestly, I've learned on this call. So things that I wasn't really, aware of or sensitive to before, but now I will. I put fishermen in the list of the agricultural people about the special unique vulnerability on carbon pricing. But I do hope you'll think about, well, how else to do it. Because it's either that regulatory approach, it's a clean energy incentive that doesn't go worldwide, or it's some pricing mechanism that does go worldwide with some accommodation for people that are quite exposed. And that would be people that use a lot of fuel to get the things that we all want and need. And that's where that's the balance we got to strike. And the permitting reform is an excellent other place where you see balance has to be struck. You got to dig that mine, that copper, but we really don't want to destroy the river in the process. So you got to do things in balance. So this will help me to have better balance. So thank you for the opportunity to learn here as I'm hopefully imparting something, but also picking up something. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. We've really appreciated that. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Good to be with you. See ya.
Have a great evening. Take care.
That's all.
Thank you.